Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while he refused. But later he said to himself, 'Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones, who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" Luke created the setting for this parable of the unjust judge to emphasize his concern for prayer. Showing Jesus in prayer seems to have been important to Luke. It begins early with Luke's version of Jesus' baptism. Now, when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also was baptized and was praying, the heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." The phrase, "and was praying," is Luke's addition to the story, and I suspect that if he had a word processor, he would have made it bold to divert attention from the baptism, which he thought was unnecessary, because he had already made Jesus God's Son from conception. Yet the baptism of Jesus was part of Luke's primary source, the Gospel of Mark. And he could not drop it, so he changed it into a reaffirmation. Now back to the parable. I suspect in the context of Jesus' life, this parable helps explain why he got himself crucified. Jesus lived under an oppressive legal system. I'm not talking about the law of Moses. The system that mattered was the Roman one, and it was greatly balanced in favor of the well-to-do. A widow didn't count. She didn't count because, well, she was a woman, and because, in this case, she appears not to have a male to advocate for her. Jesus set up this situation specifically to show the social imbalance between the woman and the judge, perhaps also between women and men in general. Let's ignore Luke's context and consider just the parable. In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but eventually he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for people, yet because this widow keeps pestering me, I will grant her justice, lest she gives me a black eye by continually coming." Justice isn't served when those in power have no respect for either their office or the people they encounter. The social disparity, while important, is not the problem here. The problem is the judge's attitude. Because the judge is a privileged person, he can assume an air of dispassionate interest in both the validity of the woman's petition and the purpose of the legal system. Because the judge sees himself as self-sufficient, he can even ignore divine call for justice. Yet it goes deeper than that. A system established to benefit the few at the expense of the many is inherently evil. By telling this parable, Jesus told folks they didn't have to accept the system as it is. They can and should be persistent in challenging unjust systems. In this sense, Jesus reflected Amos. In fact, reading a passage like our passage from Amos could be depressing, for it appears that legal systems have been out of balance for at least 2,800 years. Yet Jesus saw that it doesn't have to be that way. A legal system isn't divinely established. People create such systems to help organize their lives. And I would add that goes for the law of Moses as well. What people create, people can also modify. If a legal system is out of balance, if people can manipulate it to harm others, and if it can be hijacked by immoral, not just unjust, persons, then those victimized by the system have the capacity to change it. In this parable, Jesus uses satire to call for a radical course correction in the flow of the judicial system. Radical changes don't come easily, and the Roman legal system continued to brutalize. In fact, it brutalized Jesus to death. Yet his followers refused to accept his death as the end of his values. In many ways, his death was the beginning. Despite the hope of some people at the time, God's imperial rule did not thunder from heaven and batter Rome into a benign legal system. Instead, the system persisted. But even eternal Rome eventually crumbled, as much under the weight of its own brutality as under attack from beyond its walls. After all, walls never ensure security. They just encase injustice. The values Jesus expressed in his living have never disappeared. They have flowed along in the undercurrent of history, gradually awakening people to see the injustice around them. If Jesus were to come again, he'd do more than just sadly shake his head that unjust systems persist and wonder why bullies are still the hired henchmen of egomaniacs. Though he'd probably blush at the realization that people who call on his name build walls of prejudice and hate. No, he would find hope. Hope in the movements to right wrongs, the wrongs of the ages. He would encourage those seeking justice for long abused populations whose skin color, self-identity, sexuality have made them the brunt of unjust systems. He'd be a proud participant in taking down monuments to slaveholders and relegating them to museums where people may wonder at the cruelty of the past. Through this series, I have aimed to find an honest image of Jesus and to show how his continuing influence can differ radically from the church's icon. Many seem to think that modern scholarship threatens the survival of faith. I find it refreshing mine, because it's far easier for me to believe in the good work of an honest man than an icon devoid of any contact with reality. Virgin birth, resurrection, ascension, these entered our tradition because ancient writers tried to make Jesus appealing to the Greco-Roman mindset. We no longer live within that ancient frame. Our horizon stretches far beyond where the ancients could see with their own eyes. Our understanding of the foundation of the universe goes deeper than they could perceive. It's well past time for us to recognize these differences. Let's stop pretending that biological and physical impossibilities provide alternative ways of knowing. Above all, let's stop dealing with alternative facts and get real. For when we remove the aura of divinity from Jesus, I think we find a man teaching and living the eternal way of justice toward peace.